Hello, welcome back to Britain and Foreign Policy 1951 to 64. We've already had a look at decolonisation, relationship with America and Suez, which leads on to the wind of change. Now, before 1960, British policy had been to defeat nationalist revolts and maintain control of Africa. After Suez, colonies were given independence ever more frequently, and there is some debate as to whether that was because of Suez or because it was going to happen naturally anyway. Macmillan made his Wind of Change speech to white apartheid believers in South Africa. Not a very receptive audience, but his real audience and his main job was to convince people at home of the reality of the situation and the need for decolonisation. He believed it was the only morally acceptable policy. The Mau Mau rebellion had reinforced his view that we needed to give these colonies independence or we would have more and more rebellions and political prisoners on our hands. So the transition from empire to Commonwealth seemed successful by 1964. However, there were others amongst the population, like the League of Empire Loyalists and the Monday Club, who were set up because of the Wind of Change speech, were both strongly against the Wind of Change, as were the white settlers in Africa. However, in 1964 there were still problems, as was to be seen in Rhodesia, Gibraltar, Hong Kong and the Falklands. And you could argue we were still dreaming of empire. One benefit from this decolonisation was that Britain had paid out more in grants and aid than it ever had made out of the empire, despite the sterling area, and we were in debt to them, having agreed to pay for their war costs after World War II. Let's move on to Europe now. Well, the USA and Great Britain supported the Schuman Plan. The Schuman Plan set up the European Coal and Steel Community in 1950. And we supported it as a way to secure Europe as the Cold War took shape. 5 of the countries in it wanted to take advantage of the other country, Germany's willingness to re-establish itself as a respectable nation, and they were going to get economic concessions out of Germany. Britain were given an open door to Europe till 1957, but we saw it as something important for Europe, not necessarily for us. Britain had won the war, and there was still an illusion of us as a great power. Now, very few politicians or journalists wanted to join at this time, and Labour, the Labour Party, was suspicious of the free market principles behind it, as demonstrated by Herbert Morrison's Durham Miners quote. The Conservatives also were against it, and they were in agreement with Labour over not entering. However, they were more bothered about traditional links with Dominions, New Zealand, Canada, Australia, as being more important than Europe. In Messina in 1955, the EEC was set up, along with the Common Market, and this was formalised in the Treaty of Rome in 1957. From 1954 to 60, Britain's exports to Europe rose 29% compared to 1% towards the Commonwealth and the Sterling area countries. So, in a remarkably short period of time, our attitudes towards Europe changed because of the above and because of Suez and realisation of relative decline. The so-called economic miracle of Germany persuaded us that patterns of trade pre-World War II had changed, and in 1959 we set up the EFTA, European Free Trade Area, as an alternative to the EEC, but it was only ever moderately successful, and by 1961 we'd applied to join the EEC. In 1962, the Labour Party was still anti-Europe, and Gateskill spoke out about it in that year, against going into Europe. We did want to keep our fingers in all 3 pies, the Commonwealth, the USA and Europe, although this made negotiations over Europe very difficult. For example, the EEC had already developed complex agreements such as the Common Agricultural Policy that Britain had to agree to, but we found it very difficult to accept. We also were struggling to get special exemptions from the trade tariffs, like lamb from New Zealand. And although negotiations went on for a long time, 2 years, and Heath seemed to have been successful, right until the last moment when General de Gaulle intervened and used France's veto against us joining. Now, understandably, de Gaulle wanted to protect this European integration from les Anglo-Saxons, mainly the UK, but also the USA through us, and he didn't want another strong country in Europe. He also, after the humiliation of World War II, wanted to reassert French pride after being so badly defeated there. So therefore the British application was rejected in 1963. The other 5 members were just as disappointed as Britain was. Okay, let's have a look at the historical interpretation for the foreign policy 1951-64. We have the famous quote that Britain has lost an empire and has not yet found a role, which was the US diplomat Dean Acheson in 1950 in a report to Washington. Chris Rowe says the slowness to recognise imperial decline led to the failure to join Europe. He also says by 1964 many of the imperial illusions had been blown away, but by no means all of them. Britain had still not yet found a role. Rowe also says most of Eden's cabinet, including Macmillan, were minded to take drastic action and not wait for a long, slow democratic process over Suez. And Rowe says in retrospect the policy followed by Macmillan and MacLeod in decolonisation was extremely successful. The process did not always go as planned, but was completed with far less violence than was the case with the other colonial powers such as Belgium and Portugal. Rowe says the fundamental reason why Britain changed its mind about the EEC was economic. In 1956 Macmillan said about Suez, "It had taken such a long time, but we must win this struggle by one means or another. Without oil and the profits from oil, neither the UK nor Western Europe can survive." In response to hearing about the action in Suez, President Eisenhower said on the phone to Eden's press secretary, "This is President Eisenhower, and I can only presume you have gone mad." He also, I suppose, swore to Eden over it. Eden still maintained he was right to intervene in Suez, even after it destroyed his career. He said NASA could not be allowed to leave his thumb on Britain's windpipe. Some say the actual military intervention in Suez was successful, others say it was too slow. Thornycroft said over the affair, "To challenge a Prime Minister on his real strength," for Eden that was foreign policy, "that is a very difficult thing indeed." Lynch says, Labour MPs Gateskill and Bevan both made withering attacks on what they described as Eden's mad venture. Lynch says, Eden was tetchy and short-tempered, and it was his style and manner that did not help him, nor his ill health. Lynch says that the Conservatives presided over the decolonisation of empire, and that they did that. It was a striking example of consensus politics, because you would expect it to be Labour, but it shows the agreement of the two parties. Lynch says the basic reason why Britain ceased to be an imperial power is because it could no longer afford to remain one, afford in the financial sense. Bernard Porter says about decolonisation, the rest of us live through it, hardly noticing it. The Monday Club, the right-wing anti-decolonisation organisation, stated that Macmillan had turned the party left. Clement Attlee said, "We are not prepared to accept the principle that the most vital economic forces of this country should be handed over to an authority that is utterly undemocratic and is responsible to nobody, and that is about the Schuman Plan." Hennessy says, "It is the conventional wisdom that Suez hastened the end of empire," but the former Prime Minister Alec Douglas Hume disagreed with this in 1987 in an interview. Derek Murphy says, "Clearly the military expedition was a failure in its own terms about Suez." Murphy also says the crisis demonstrated that Britain could not make military intervention or take military intervention without the US backing it, so it was reasonable to cut back on troops. Anthony Lowe says all parties were already committed to allowing the colonies self-rule before Suez. John Darwin says the influence of Suez was subtle and diffuse, and the most influential aspect of the Suez crisis was the fear that Britain might again find herself isolated and friendless. Edmund Dell, a Labour MP historian, argued that Britain missed the bus when Bevin failed to participate in the Schuman plans in 1950. John Young says British politicians knew by 1955 that the Commonwealth trade preference was less important than it had been, so we should have joined Europe then. Revisionist historians have suggested that Britain did not want to catch the bus, and we did not have an obvious reason to do so and to join Europe, and that's what Alan Millward, one of them, says. Wolfram Kaiser says that Macmillan's application to join the EEC helped restore the special relationship and control the growing split in the Conservative Party over Europe. And that's it for the Foreign Policy 1951-64.